Hi everybody, I'm Chanel, and in this video I'm going to share with you my story and how I found out my son was on the autism spectrum. Now the reason I'm doing this is because when I was going through it, I didn't have anybody around me who knew anything about autism. I didn't know anything about autism, and there were things happening that were huge red flags, and I missed the opportunity to get him early intervention, which is services before he turns 3 years old. So he turned 3 and we weren't able to get early intervention. We ended up getting great services, but 3 is sometimes considered late for a diagnosis. I had spoken to the doctor, I spoke to his daycare center, I talked to his dad. Everybody said, no, I'm tripping. Like, the doctor said, no, don't say that. The daycare center told me that boys develop slower than girls, which is not true. So I was just getting pacified by people around me instead of people actually, knowing what they were talking about. Nobody knew what they were talking about. So first thing I want to say is I am not a doctor and I am not an autism expert, but I am an expert in parenting because I have 3 kids and they all in one piece. So there you go. I'm going to be talking about all things autism and ADHD. So if you feel like that will benefit you in any way, please hit the subscribe button. If you don't think it'll benefit you, thank you for being here anyway. Appreciate you. So let's get into it. I do want to say before I get started on the symptoms, if your child has one of these symptoms or even all of these symptoms, it does not mean that your child is on the autism spectrum. It does mean that you should get an assessment right away to find out if he does or she doesn't, whatever it is. We have to be our children's advocates. And for me, I was so frustrated because I kept saying there is something different. I already had an older child and I knew that some of the things that he was doing was like, what the fuck? So I needed someone to hear me, and no one was listening. He was verbal, and I think that was part of everyone's confusion because at the time, like I said, I did not know a lot about autism. I just knew that a child with autism potentially was nonverbal. And so since he was speaking, I was like, okay, well, it's not autism because he's speaking. That is not true. Now we know there's a spectrum, and children with autism can be very verbal or very non-verbal. It's a huge spectrum. That's why it's called spectrum. So the first and probably most obvious symptom is a speech delay. My son hadn't said mommy until he was 3 years old. And the way that he was speaking was odd. He would exhibit something that I now know is called echolalia. Echolalia is when a child may use repeated words, a repetition of words. Sometimes it's meaningless. It's usually from something that they've watched or heard someone else say. So I know my son would say, I would ask him something, maybe, how was your day? How was daycare or whatever? And he would say, it's magically delicious. I'm like, okay. So that was odd, right? A child on the spectrum might also say words back to you. So if you say, do you want water? They may say water. Do you want bread? Bread? They'll just repeat the word instead of answering yes or no. That was something that was definitely a huge red flag that I knew wasn't normal, but I just felt was him. That's just the way he speaks. It's just this quirkiness that that's kind of funny. I remember thinking he could be an actor because he's memorizing all these lines from stuff that he's watching on the TV, and it was a sign of autism. Number 2, screaming and screeching. I guess because he didn't have the words, there was a lot of screaming, trying to communicate with me, but it was exhausting and really draining as a parent to hear him screaming himself to sleep, screeching to communicate. It was pretty difficult to get through. Number 3, he was obsessed, and still is, with trains. He would line his trains up in a row. Lining things up in a row is also sometimes considered a red flag. Children with autism like to line their toys up. He was obsessed with trains and not showing interest in anything else. And that obsession as a child is also a flag. It's also a red flag. Most kids like a variety of things, or even if you try to introduce them to something new, they're open to it. He was not open to it. He was not having it. Is it trains? Because that's all I want to talk about is Thomas and some trains. That's it. Number 4, playing alongside other kids and not directly with them. I took him to a birthday party when he was 3 years old, and other kids were chasing each other, playing with each other in a circle, running around clockwise in a circle. And he was running by himself counterclockwise alongside them, like not talking to them or interacting with them at all. And that was a red flag for me. This was right around the time when I was like, I got to start doing some research and take things into my own hands. I can't wait for doctors and, care providers and that kind of thing to figure out what's going on with my child. The lack of eye contact was there also. Again, I just thought it was him. He had a high tolerance for pain. I remember he was eating like some spicy chicken nuggets, and I didn't mean to get spicy. They gave me spicy, and his nose was running, eyes were burned, and he was still eating it. And when I tasted one, I was like, oh my God, like these are really spicy. And he just pushed through it and ate them. And he won't do that anymore, but he did back then. His tolerance for pain was pretty high. So the last thing that happened that made me say I'm getting an assessment was I was watching Super Why with him. So if you're familiar with this show, it's one of those interactive shows where they want the kids to speak back to the TV. And he watched it intently, standing in front of the TV, and Wyatt says, I'm Wyatt, and what's your name? And you're supposed to say what your name is. And he never said it. And I just thought it was so weird, because I've seen other kids like just screaming at the TV when they ask a question from these kind of shows, Dora and that kind of thing. So he wouldn't say his name, and I just happened to have the computer in front of me. I Googled 3-year-old won't say his name. And all of this information came up on autism, and I was furious. I was so mad because I had been saying for at least a year and a half that something was different about my child, and no one would listen to me except for my mother, who's an RN, who didn't have expertise in the area of autism, but she knew that he didn't seem to be developing correctly. And so I cried. That's a normal response. Just know that if you have cried, there's nothing wrong with that. It's an unknown. I didn't know what was going to happen with him. Was he going to be able to get a job? Was he going to be able to have a girlfriend? Was he going to live in my basement until he's like 50 years old? Like, I didn't know what any of it meant, and it was really scary, and I cried. Once I dried those tears, though, I was like, what do I got to do? Because I know he is entitled to some services. So what I did was I called 311 and told them, in New York it's 311. You could probably look online now. This was 9 years ago. But I told them that I suspect my child may be on the autism spectrum, and they sent me a packet full of agencies or daycare centers that actually did assessments. So I picked one. They came to his daycare center and they assessed him at the center, and they concluded that there was some concerns. They don't give you, at least back then, not sure about now, but they do not give you a diagnosis until the child is 5 years old. They don't give you an actual autism diagnosis. They may say it appears that way or whatever, but on paper, there's no diagnosis until they turn 5. So they put him pretty quickly into a private school that I did not have to pay for. He received OT and speech therapy, and on a regular basis, the bus would come and pick him up. He loved taking the bus. By now, he was 4 years old, and he did really, really well in school. So as a parent, you have the right to request that your child gets an assessment from the school or from the doctor. Like, legally, it is your right. I'm going to do a whole video on the rights of parents when it comes to this kind of thing. If you have any questions for me, please drop them in the comments. And, I'm just here to help parents like myself. So today, my son is almost 13 years old. He is really smart. He's in the 7th grade. He goes to a private school. He is thriving. And he has his own YouTube channel that's focused solely on trains. So he's doing really well. And it is the steps that I took along the way and the help that I was able to get him right away that I think got him on track. And I'm going to be talking about those steps in hopes that it may help somebody else. So thank you for watching. Take care. Peace.